All right, welcome back to the Bastion Black Performance Podcast. So this is podcast number 2. So the first podcast, I talked about some of the strategic decisions, or rather certain countries, or what the German military got out of various countries that they invaded in World War II. And so I'll kind of do the same thing for the Allies, particularly the Western Allies, just to kind of help us have a little bit of a better than surface level understanding of why some of these choices were made as we start to talk about more advanced things as I do more and more podcasts on this. And I think one thing to keep in mind is that one thing that's easy to do that's incorrect is as we look back on history is that we kind of think that all of the things that happened were always foregone conclusions. So for example, that it's like we were always going to invade northern France and fight the Germans in the West from that way. And that's just not true. Obviously, things played out the way that they did, but not all of these things were always a foregone conclusion. So we'll kind of start out with, I'll try to stay roughly in chronological order, but I'll bounce around and, I'll kind of have to, one, just because I'm erratic like that, but also I'm not just going to read off a list and go event by event, because one, I think that sucks to listen to, but also I'm going to kind of stick with the primary events, the primary countries and primary things that happen versus trying to get too specific about too many things and making it, kind of something that I don't want it to be. So obviously, we kind of know that, so World War II kicked off, I guess, realistically, we say in September of 1939, with the German and Soviet invasions of Poland. And then in 1940, the Germans invade Denmark, they invade Norway, they invade France. 41, they begin Operation Barbarossa in the Eastern Front of World War II. So the British military, the British Expeditionary Force, had been kicked off of the continent following the invasion of France in the Low Countries. So, in the summer of 1940. So the operations that we're referring to basically are things that take place after that, because obviously, this includes once the British had kind of been expelled from the continent proper. So a lot of the initial operations, obviously, were kind of either run entirely by the British or at their behest, or they were supplied / commanded by them. For obvious reasons, they were still a country that existed in its entirety and had its own command structure and supply and equipment and everything like that, where while there were Poles and there were Frenchmen and Danes and everything who were in England and contributing, obviously they weren't really doing so under the banner and the guise of their own countries on that. So we'll kind of start right away in 1940. So the British, what they tended to operate for a good chunk of the first part of World War II is traditionally called the British Naval Peripheral Strategy. So what a naval peripheral strategy, or peripheral strategy kind of in general, the way that they execute it is basically because the British have a very substantial navy, and so they have the ability to move and ferry people and things around a lot with that. Historically, they've tended to concentrate their operations in the areas of things that they can easily supply from sea, but where they can also easily disembark and re-embark their troops and supplies from those places, as opposed to get involved in really deep and or substantial internal commitments on the European continent itself. So, for example, if you think back to the Peninsular Wars in the back in the early 19th century, the Napoleonic Wars, so fought primarily in Spain, but things where the British were able to bring the French into obviously into the Iberian Peninsula and fight them from multiple different places, but really kind of extend them out and use their own naval presence to be able to, one, get themselves there obviously, but supply and support themselves there, whereas they would not have been able to do such a thing to France proper, across the English Channel or even in the Mediterranean on that. And so as we look at World War II, very comparable. In a way, the naval peripheral strategy, it includes a lot of, actual substantial military operations and a lot of commando operations. So now I want to be very careful when I talk about the commando operations, because it's interesting when you actually read about them. Like most of the commando operations were so small and insignificant isn't even like a strong enough word. Like literally just nothing happened. But a lot of it was kind of a propaganda campaign by Churchill himself, which was, you know, he wanted to set the country ablaze, or set the continent ablaze and spread terror all up and down the Atlantic Wall, I think was his, you know, one of the phrases, you know, that he used on that. And so obviously some of the raids were successful and did accomplish things, but for the most part, what the commando raids were kind of used for is, you know, to sort of bolster the morale of the population, the people back home, that, hey, we all are still doing things, even though we got kicked out of the continent, we're still doing things on that. And also to gain experience in certain types of raids and operations that would have to be performed later in the large scale operations that would come later in the war. So kind of beginning in 1940, so the British, you know, they begin forming commando units. And so the commando units operated almost entirely against France and Norway. That's basically the only places that the commandos ever did anything, you know, as far as their raids go. So the reasons why they were conducting commando raids against Norway, for example. So one, obviously, you know, we talked about in the previous video that the Germans had a substantial presence of naval personnel there for their U-boats and for their various surface fleet. Norway was also a country, it was also a place where they had they got a lot of mineral and other supply support, both from Norway itself, but also in, you know, iron ore and things from Sweden, things that went through Norway and then found their way back to Germany that way. Also things like fish oil and glycerin and pyrite and things that they used to make explosives and various other things that they needed for the war effort. And then in their pursuit of the atom bomb, the so-called heavy water and things like that were things that they manufactured in Norway and attempted to ship back to Germany proper. So the commando raids, what they served was obviously a chance to destroy some of these things, and a couple of the particular raids in Norway were very successful as far as destroying fish oil tanks and glycerine and things like that. But also it kept a lot of German units, a lot of German forces tied up in Norway that could have been used elsewhere. So just the continual, and you'll kind of see this, you know, throughout the course of World War II, is that they kind of just regularly did some sort of pretty small but committed raid to Norway, and a lot of that was just to make sure that the Germans were keeping people there that could have otherwise gone elsewhere. So again, part of that peripheral strategy, spread an enemy out away from, you know, being able to concentrate and you know, keep them in sort of far-flung areas where they're kind of wearing themselves down from a manpower and from a supply and logistics standpoint. Then, you know, also, so kind of moving with the commando raids into France proper. So the commando raids into France took place for a longer amount of time, but were almost entirely just either operations to try to capture German personnel, you know, for questioning, to capture radar, intelligence or equipment, or other such things related to their air defenses. You know, some operations about spotlights and being able to garner intelligence from that, and then a little bit later being able to find intelligence on what kinds of obstacles were on various beaches for upcoming potential naval assaults, you know, including Operation Overlord and things like that. So commando raids almost entirely, like I said, Norway and France. And then in 1942, you have the what they call, you know, kind of quote unquote the greatest raid. So Operation Chariot, I believe it's called. Yeah, Chariot was the raid into Saint-Nazaire. Which, I'll be honest, I don't know how you can call something the greatest raid where basically everybody who goes there gets captured or killed at the end of it. It's kind of, I don't know, it seems like a suicide mission to me. But so basically what the raid was, it was a raid to destroy the dry dock related facilities of Saint-Nazaire, which was a major, even to this day, it's a major shipbuilding area of France. So a dry dock is the kind of place where when you have these large battleships, battle cruisers like the Tirpitz, like the Bismarck, like the Graf Spee, like the Gneisenau, the Prinz Eugen, things like that, you obviously it goes out to do battle to destroy merchant shipping, gets in a fight with the British or whatever. And obviously, if you're slinging around 16-inch shells that weigh upwards of 1,700 pounds each, you suffer some damage. So when you go back to port, you put it in the dry dock, you fix some of these things, and after each operation, you kind of send it back out. That's pretty standard operating procedure. So by destroying these dry dock facilities, which in San Nazaire is on the Bay of Biscay there, so it opens up to the Atlantic Ocean proper. The Tirpitz, for example, was never able to operate outside of Norway itself, for the most part, basically being confined to the fjord area, and then in trying to deal with, sort of that last leg of the Arctic convoys, and never able to just kind of get out into the open Atlantic Ocean itself, where it could potentially, actually be a really lethal opponent out there. So by destroying that, helping to bottle up, German surface vessels, in places where they could more easily be contained, and then, dealt with and then attacked. And there were numerous attacks on the Tirpitz. I don't remember how many. I think it was finally sunk in 1944, but big ass battleship like that, it takes some effort to put one of those down. So we can kind of move away from the commando raids a little bit, and now we'll kind of get into more like, typical military operations. So, like I said, we kind of started in 1940 with the commando raids, and the commando raids were big for, like 40, 41, 42, and a little bit in 43. But obviously, after that point, there were so many operations going on. I assume that's kind of why they sort of just started to fall off on that, as far as the prevalence of those. So in 1940, the Italians join up with the Germans after the capitulation of France at the Treaty of Compiègne there. And so the Italians had, launched military operations in Africa, kind of some of their colonies there, trying to extend their stuff. And obviously part of Mussolini's idea was the reformation of the Roman Empire. But it turns out that Mussolini sucks at everything, and the Italian military is just completely inept from an equipment standpoint, from a leadership standpoint. Just everything about them is completely inept. So the Italians basically get themselves embroiled fighting with the British in North Africa and call for German help. So the Germans eventually have to send the Africa Corps down there under General and then later Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. So the British obviously have contingents in North Africa, at this time. And so they are fighting with the Italians from the get-go. And so obviously the primary things the British are trying to do initially is, one, they're protecting Egypt. So Egypt, controls the Suez Canal. And so while the Mediterranean itself was not really a major part of the British naval traffic as far as their supply and logistics and disposition goes at this point of the war, because the Italian Navy was still around in force. And while the Italian Navy was very behind the times from a technological standpoint, they still had a substantial force. So it's something that had to be taken seriously. And then with the Italians and the Germans being present in the Mediterranean in force as far as their air assets go, this wasn't really utilized a lot at this point in the war, for the supply side of things. But control of the Suez Canal is obviously an absolutely vital strategic asset for the British, especially because the British they're fighting in Burma, they're fighting, in various parts of the Pacific, to some extent, to one extent or another. And so being able to get their units there, obviously the whole point of the Suez Canal is to cut out having to go all the way around, the Cape of Hope and go around of, South Africa there. So obviously they have to protect that. So they begin feeding more and more, units and more commands into this in North Africa. And so initially primarily defensive, or, there's a little bit of an offensive from the defensive standpoint as far as the British were concerned. But they kind of land, more and more troops and begin fighting, substantial operations in the desert. And the North African campaign rages for a long time. I mean, so almost 3 full years that the fight in North Africa is going on. So it gets overlooked because obviously other theaters of war, were larger from a total size component, total men, material, and things like that. But the North African campaign was a very substantial campaign. So the British are fighting there to obviously maintain control the Suez Canal, and then the ability to navigate the Mediterranean, whereas the Italians are more or less trying to do the opposite of that. They're trying to extend their control over most or all of North Africa, so they can kind of regain the control of the Mediterranean on that. And then you also have to remember, too, so you have the Straits of Gibraltar there, which the British had maintained control of, especially at this time. So, the Straits of Gibraltar is only, something like 10 or 15 miles across. So obviously being able to control that. This also, they could prevent German naval assets from making it into the Mediterranean to sort of tip the balance there. And conversely, by controlling it themselves, this is how they're going to be able to, supply themselves, for follow-on actions in the Mediterranean. So as this continues to, grow and grow, so now by 1942, the Germans are now in North Africa, assisting the Italians, because again, the Italians are just completely inept. And one could make a pretty legitimate argument that being friends with Italy potentially was a core level thing that cost them any chance to win the war, getting them bogged down in the Balkans, getting them bogged down in North African campaign, and all those things. So the Germans dispatched the Africa Corps to North Africa, which the Africa Corps never really consisted of more than a few divisions, 3 or 4 divisions at any one time. So most of the troops were Italian, and at various times the Italians got just absolutely decimated. So it was the Italian 10th Army, I believe, got destroyed in 1941, and lost hundreds of thousands of men, and and then so obviously the Germans had to come in and assist them. So while the British are here fighting for this, it's also starting to suck in more German elements as far as air assets, naval assets, because obviously they have to be able to supply their own troops, and get their own supplies down there. And so the Americans would obviously join in Operation Torch in 1942. And so by this point, the North African campaign had basically been won in 1942 with the Second Battle of El Alamein. But the Germans are basically retreating back towards Tripoli, back towards where their bases are, and they're being chased, across the desert by the British. So then the British and Americans land another force, basically in the western part of North Africa there, Morocco, Algeria, things like that, and are moving towards them and basically completely surround them. And so they take, hundreds of thousands of prisoners between Italians and Germans, capture tons of equipment. It's where they first encounter the Panzerkampfwagen 6, the Tiger. So they had a very early interactions with that tank in North Africa and things like that. So invading North Africa, very important, from that standpoint. And now once the Germans are ejected from North Africa, so obviously they retreat back across the Mediterranean to Sicily. So again, like I talked about in the previous video, Sicily is not very far from the at least the furthest north parts of North Africa, so something like 75 miles. So they retreat back to Sicily. And so next, in 1943, the Allies invade Sicily. So now the reason for invading Sicily, aside from the fact that there were Germans and Italians there, is that Sicily was close enough that air assets from North Africa could be used to, not only protect, but also to prosecute the operations there. So the Sicilian campaign was pretty small in, terms of like total numbers involved, but very, very important as far as operationally and strategically, because now the Germans have been completely kicked off of the North African continent, off of Sicily, so they're back to Italy proper. The Allies now have places they can start to move assets closer to be able to sort of prosecute operations into Italy proper. And one thing to keep in mind when it comes to when we're talking about air assets and things like that, so it's not just about whether or not air assets can reach certain places, or when they reach them, do they have time to actually like fly around and find things to shoot at, find things to bomb and whatever. But it's also, okay, you have to assume that there's going to be certain casualties, a certain amount of aircraft are going to be damaged and lost and things. So the further away or the closer to their absolute limit of their range that they operate at, and the more that they're over enemy territory throughout that, the more that you're going to lose those assets as total losses when they come back. I.e., so if you were having to do all of your air-related missions from North Africa itself, so now they're going into Sicily, Italy area or whatever, doing whatever operations. So now everyone that is low on fuel, that's crippled, that's taken damage, they have to fly across the Mediterranean Sea and things like that. So you're going to lose even more to attrition, and then you're going to lose more trained crews and things to attrition because they're not going to be able to crash or jump out and I about said eject. They didn't have ejection seats at the time in aircraft, but they're not going to be able to bail out of the planes and be picked up and be able to be back in another plane fairly soon at this point. So we. So 1943, Operation Husky, we go into Sicily. Very quick operation. We basically kick everybody out of there real quick. The Germans actually do a fantastic job of retreating from there. They managed to get basically all of their men and equipment, to Messina and across, into Italy proper, which is, it's typically held as one of the great, successful retreats, of history of World War II there. So being able to get the majority of their men and materiel into Italy proper. So then later in 43, the invasion of Italy itself happened. So invading Italy, from a strategic standpoint, has several reasons why we would do that. So one, obviously at this time, Italy is still a very active ally of the Germans. So being able to knock them out of the war would be a severe blow to the total manpower that the Axis powers have. Also as far as equipment and things like that. Then you could, from a strategic standpoint, you could talk about the political prestige and the loss of prestige. So at this time, if you're the German military, the German, the country at large. So you're dealing with the Italians, you're dealing with the Romanians, the Hungarians. You have the Finns fighting the continuation war. You have all of these list of people who are your allies who are actively contributing to these operations. So being able to prove to them that, one, that you can be successful, but also that hey, we will back you up, if these things go poorly, is really important. So, for the Allies to be able to knock Italy out of the war would be a big deal. So obviously that's hugely important. So invasion goes forward there. Another thing is, as they start to take over parts of Italy, so now we can get airfields in Italy itself. So getting airfields in Italy, so the 15th Air Force, eventually based out of Italy, the Air Foggia, was their, the main air base, opens up a world of possibilities. So now you have the 8th Air Force in England, you have the 15th Air Force in Italy. So now the strategic bombing campaign can take place from two different places itself. So now things that are within easy range are oil fields of Romania, oil fields of Hungary, pretty much any part of Germany at the for the most part. Obviously, they can interdict things, within the Mediterranean and the corresponding, the Adriatic, the Tyrrhenian, the Ionian, Balearic Seas, and things like that. France itself, southern France, so able to, run operations out of there. So if we think about this in a strategic and an operational standpoint, so say, you could, pick a numbers. I'm just going to make numbers up. Let's say you have 50,000 combat aircraft that you could contribute to a particular campaign, but you have to have a place to put them and to operate them. So if you don't have Italy or some other country and you only have England, you can't fit all of those aircraft in England to do this campaign. So you would have, essentially this, the large amount of aircraft and equipment sitting around not doing anything. So you take over this other country, Italy, for example, or parts of Italy at the time, obviously, and you establish new airfields and new facilities and everything like that. Now you can get more of these, aircraft. You can get more equipment into operation, into the fight there. And that's where the operational and then the strategic side of things come into play there. Obviously, with this also, you have the tactical assets for air, being able to actually just interdict things on the ground themselves in Italy. So invading Italy, very big deal as far as that goes. And kind of back to something I sort of talked about a little bit right at the beginning of the podcast, was that we kind of take it for granted that, the Allies were always going to invade France and they were going to launch their primary campaign in the West from France. And that's just simply not true. There was a very serious discussion about invading the Balkans as the primary front to be opened up in the West And one of the main reasons, or possibly the main reason, was that one, they would still be fulfilling their, kind of promises to the Soviet Union as far as open up another large front, but also being able to deny future Soviet influence in all of these areas where they obviously maintained it after World War II. So that was a very serious, a very real, potential at the time. So so kind of backtrack a little bit. So obviously we said that so these the invasion of Sicily, invasion of Italy takes place in 1943. So let's kind of backtrack just a little bit. We'll get out of the Mediterranean for a second, and we'll go over to France, northern France again. So we'll talk about, this isn't really an invasion at the time, but so Operation Jubilee. So Operation Jubilee it's usually listed as a reconnaissance in force. It was basically a very large scale raid comprising something like 10,000 total personnel against a defended port in the north of France. And so several reasons why the Allies did this from an operational and strategic standpoint. So one is just that nobody had ever attacked a defended harbor in a large scale way and tried to take it over. So one, they don't really know if you can do it, how you do it, how well it's going to go, what sort of equipment and things you need, how can we do it. So the other thing was that, now the Canadians were in Britain, they were in England in force, and they wanted to get into the action. They wanted to be used. So they sent primarily Canadians to do this, as well as multiple commando elements, and then United States Army Ranger elements, which, to do attacks on artillery positions that were supporting the Dieppe defenders there. And so, like I said, the easiest way to think of this is basically the plan was to raid Dieppe, take it over, hold it for a designated amount of time, and then fall back so they could test the feasibility of it, see how well it would work, what they would need to do in the future. Because, and so this happens in the summer of 42. And so, as much as the Soviets were, complaining, often and loudly that there needed to be another front opened up, which apparently to them, North Africa didn't count and all of that. So we won't get into that argument. But so this was something that had to be done before a really large scale, offensive could be, done on something like this. Now, as it turned out, I guess one other component of the raid at Dieppe was also that because they were going to commit large forces to this, the thought was that this was also going to draw out either a large or a total response from the fighter arm of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. So the British thought that, okay, while we're doing the Dieppe stuff, they're going to have to respond with most or all of their air assets to deal with this, and then we will be ready, pounce on them with a large portion of fighter command, and be able to deal them a substantial blow, a substantial defeat in terms of the air. So now, what's funny about this is basically all that actually happened with Operation Jubilee is that the British landed a bunch of people on the beach who then just walked directly into German captivity. They literally didn't do anything. Everything failed. They, they basically got off the boats. They had a bunch of brand new Churchill tanks, which all, as soon as they went up in the sand, they all just got stuck there. So none of them made it back. The Canadians basically went into the town, and then they all got surrounded and surrendered. Some of the commando raids basically all got slaughtered. Then, as far as the large-scale fighter response, the British showed up in force. The Germans came in. The Germans shot down something like 110 of them and lost 40 or 50 of their own. So it went completely the opposite direction the British thought. Again, you could not make up a more hilariously terrible attempt at this. And so Dieppe actually goes so badly that, so this is summer of 1942. Dieppe goes so poorly that the Allies basically agree to postpone for an additional year before they try some form of large-scale cross-channel invasion. So obviously, Operation Overlord didn't happen until June of 1944. So, it actually goes so poorly that they were like, listen, 1943 is still too soon for us to be ready for this. We're going to have to, need an additional year to do that. But the reason for that, for as badly as it went and as terrible as it was, they did glean a lot of the information that they would eventually use successfully attack Normandy in 1944. So Jubilee was basically something that always had to happen, probably, but for it to go as badly as it did, kind of nobody really thought that. So I always think I think things like that are funny when you spend, I can't even imagine how much, time and effort you spend planning something like that. And then not only does it go poorly, like you would have literally been better off if you had just landed people on the beach with no weapons and just marched them with bagpipes directly into the prisoner of war camp down the street. They would have been better off. Talking about that from a strategic standpoint, operational standpoint. So that's 1942. So we talked about France, in 42, Italy and Sicily in 43. So now we can kind of move into, if we want to stay chronological, I've already started to talk about the 8th Air Force and the 15th Air Force. And so this doesn't really count as an invasion, but we have to include what the strategic air campaign gave us as far as, so if we're talking about the peripheral strategy and we're talking about all of the operations that the Allies conducted that essentially sucked more and more German units away from the east, away from Germany itself, away from being able to do other things into more far-flung parts of the continent, then we definitely have to include talking about the strategic air campaign. So I'm not going to really get into a lot of details about the successes and the failures of the strategic air campaign itself. But so the RAF Bomber Command have been in operation basically since the beginning of the war. The Americans start to show up in 42. By 42 and 43, we're contributing large-scale daytime bombing raids over Western Europe. At this time, the Germans had daylight superiority in the air up until the spring of 1944. So they're taking a lot of horrendous casualties at this time. But a couple things that are very important to note is so that as this is going on, the so-called defense of the Reich, which is the German military's efforts to protect Western Europe and Germany itself from the Allied air campaign, it's sucking more and more men, machines, equipment, and things back to it. So by the time that we actually get to, so if we look at the total of the defense of the Reich, so from a strictly number standpoint, so defense of the Reich at its peak. So this was at one time. So this isn't in totality. So at one time, at its peak, which would have been about the middle of 1944, there's over 1.1 million total personnel serving in the defense of the Reich. Whether you're talking about people serving on searchlight batteries, anti-aircraft batteries, pilots and crew, and things like that. They are operating 11,000 88 millimeter flak cannons, over 4,000 105 millimeter, 128 millimeter flak cannons, over 30,000 20 millimeter and 37 millimeter guns, and so like it's a number that's just, it's incomprehensible. So if we think about what the Germans could have done with what they could have done with an extra 11,000. What would in total would have been an extra 16,000, 17,000, 88s, 105s, and 128s, as far as like actual artillery, particularly on the Eastern Front at this time, that would be, immeasurably helpful. And there's actually people who have posited that the Germans actually would have been better served in World War II if they had directed a large chunk of their actual production of their tank units and used those same material to build artillery pieces and to build anti-tank guns. In totality for the heavy guns, over 16,000, 88s, 105s, 128s, and then over 30,000, 20 millimeter and 37 millimeter flak guns. So that's just an inhuman amount of things. And then over 1.1 million people. So now a lot of these would have been women and either younger or older men or injured people who probably wouldn't be, frontline capable, but these are still personnel that need to be, that could have served elsewhere. In addition to that, so when we look at the total numbers, so of the total German aircraft losses, more than about 4 times as many aircraft were destroyed in the West, like versus the Western Allies, whether in the Mediterranean, the defense of the Reich or in the Balkans, as were destroyed on the Eastern Front. So while there's always the argument of, oh, how much did the Soviets contribute? How much did the Americans or the British, or, who won whatever? One thing we know unequivocally is that the strategic air campaign of the defense of the Reich, it cost the Germans 4 times as many aircraft as the operations against the Soviets in the East did. So that's an absolutely humongous undertaking, just humongous discrepancy as far as that goes. And so again, this is not to take into total account how successful the strategic air campaign was. At certain points, it was absolutely very successful. The Ruhr campaign comes to mind, and then some of the latter oil campaigns of 44. But as far as being able to stretch personnel, absolutely very effective. And so as we kind of get done with the, we talked about the air campaign, and so now kind of moving into the actual invasions of France in force itself. So obviously, June 5th and 6th, 1944, you've got Operation Overlords, the invasion of Normandy, i.e. the cross-channel invasion into northern France itself. So obviously, everyone's, familiar with D-Day and some of these things. So obviously, opening up some form of large front, and I won't call it the second front, because really at this point, it's the third, fourth, or fifth front that the Allies have opened up, at this time. And so this one is obviously the largest single one. But so a couple main things. So one, obviously, from a strategic standpoint of being able to suck more elements away from the Soviets, who are, after the surrender of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad in early 1943, and then the Germans obviously they launch Operation Citadel in the summer, so in July of 1943. The attack in the Kursk salient there, and then the corresponding Soviet Operation Kutuzov attacking them. So the Germans are on continual retreat at this point. So after their massive attack in July of 43, the Germans are never again on the offensive in the East. And so as the Soviets are continually advancing against them, it's hard to imagine the disaster that was the summer of 1944 for the German military. So the Allies land in force in France, which obviously begins to eat away a lot of divisions. So if we actually look at the breakdown of the disposition of the German units and where they're actually situated. So by June of 1944, so the Germans had 150 divisions in the East. In the West, and then in Norway, and then North Africa and Italy. So we're looking at, over 110, 120 divisions between them. Well, if you include the Balkans, I suppose. So the Balkans would be primarily anti-partisan operations, but also the Allies have a large contingent of commando and other such things assisting the partisans there. So 150 divisions in the East, and then you're looking at, about 120, 110, 120 divisions spread throughout the other fronts. By July, this has shifted. So now, so obviously the Soviets launch Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944. The Americans, the British, the Canadians launch Operation Overlord, and so it's almost impossible to fully appreciate the disaster that was this time. So the Germans took something like over 500,000 total casualties in the Normandy campaign. They took 700,000 to 800,000 casualties in the in Operation Bagration, and this all comes within the span of a couple of months simultaneously. Just unbelievable. So by July of 1944, the Germans are down 25 full divisions on the East. On the West, the divisions have now increased. As we go through, as we get into August and September, now the discrepancy gets even greater. So by the time we get to the end of 1944, so obviously by this point, France has been, recaptured. I mean, not entirely. Obviously, there's still elements, that are fighting in France itself. But for the most part, the country itself has been primarily liberated. So now at this point, by the time we get to December of 44, so you're looking at about 135 divisions in the East. Now, also you have to think that a lot of these formations are not full strength. So these are kind of divisions by name, but we don't really, know exactly, how many people are in each and every division. Then you look at the West. So just the West itself, 76 divisions. Norway, 17 divisions. The Balkans, 22. Italy, 25 divisions. So if we just add up, what the Western Allies were contributing there, so you get to, you get to 120, 130 divisions, in the Mediterranean in the West, and then 135 divisions in the East. So, so the idea that the entirety of the German military was fighting in the East is only true, when you use specific times of the war. So at this time, absolutely catastrophic numbers for the German military, and and obviously the Allies contributing to this. So we talk about Normandy in 1944, and so obviously the primary invasion there. But we also have to remember that in the late summer of 1944, there's an additional. So we invade southern France. So Operation Dragoon in southern France, and so obviously the same primary reasons for invading France are still there. Another reason strategically why invading southern France is so important is so for guys who who are a little more educated and who know. So while yes, the goal was to get substantial forces on the continent across the Channel, but the goal was always to take some form of deep water port. You just divisions use hundreds of tons of supplies every week, and so you're talking about landing 160,000 people just the first day of D-Day, but then you're talking about landing millions of men through into Northern Europe, or into Northern France at the time. So the goal was always to take a major deep water port, Cherbourg, Le Havre, Boulogne, places like that. So using Normandy as a place where we could more easily land, but then branching out from there and capturing one of these ports. And so guys who know is that we took across like some kind of fake harbors they called mulberry harbors that were able to supply troops and supplies and oils and things like that, while we were trying to get the operations to actually like take over one of these major ports. And then the Germans, rather smartly, they had these ports very fortified, and they destroyed the equipment and everything in these ports before they finally surrendered them, or before they were finally taken over. So then the invasion of southern France in the late summer of 1944, a large part of it was also to capture additional port facilities. You've got Nice and Marseille in southern France, and then you're working up the Rhone Valley there, and so getting additional large ports opens up additional supply abilities. And guys who are familiar with this, so as you get to the end of the summer and early fall of 1944, basically the gas crisis in the Western Allies comes to a complete head, and this is where they basically call a full stop. Eisenhower gives approval to Browning and to Montgomery to try Operation Market Garden, where they do the completely ill-fated attempt to parachute 3 different parachute divisions into Belgium and Belgium, Holland, the Netherlands there, and then race 30 Corps up the quote-unquote highway of death, and to get across the Rhine River in the fall there. And a lot of that was predicated on the fact that they did not have enough fuel to continue the large across the front advance they were doing. So the Allies invade southern France, end of 1944. So now you spread the Germans even thinner. So now you've got to have Army Group G down in the south there, so in the Rhone Valley. So now you have the Western Allies who are advancing south and east, encircling Paris, at the end of the summer at this time. And now you have these forces that are moving straight up the Rhone Valley, straight towards the Vosges Mountains and into northeast France, and right up to the border of Germany itself. So so being able to, one, draw Germans away from certain areas, but also if you have all these men, you have all this material, you have all this logistic support, find a way to get it into action. So that's what this did. So being able to get the elements there, as we're moving up. So those kind of comprise, most of the major operations there. I guess, as you're going through, from this point, everything becomes kind of more of just what is the best way to approach the actual, the heartland of Germany itself. So, Germany obviously has, natural defenses in the Rhine River, traditional defensive line for them. But then you also have the so-called Siegfried Line, as the Western Allies call it, the Westwall, as the Germans called it, the West Wall defenses there. So being able to find ways around that, which again, these don't really come into the strategic standpoints. I won't get into them. They come more operational, as far as their necessity as this goes. But the other thing that happens is as we liberate France, now we get a lot more free French and other contributing French personnel to the military effort and things like that. And now having France as a large established base, it's obviously much easier to continue operations into Belgium and the Netherlands and Holland and Luxembourg and then Germany itself. So those are kind of the primary operations of the Western Allies. I'm kind of not going to touch too much on the Soviets and the in the East, because while there's obviously definitely strategic implications of the things they did, you can kind of break their operations into basically they're driving the Germans back to Germany wherever they are, and in doing so, they're going through the Ukraine and Romania and Hungary and Czech Republic and Poland and places like that. But from a strategic standpoint, them punching in a large way down into Romania and Hungary, as we get to the end of 1944, obviously the Eastern Front is still a humongous front in terms of the actual geographical area. So a lot of it also comes down to trying to pick where they're going to, have their emphasis. Like, what are they going to emphasize? You can't just have everybody move forward all at the same time. You still have to pick some place to overwhelm. And so being able to, so operations against Romania and Hungary serve the purpose of, one, knocking Romania out of the war, and Romania ends up turning coat against the Germans, and obviously Romania has a large amount of oil that they're contributing to the German war effort. Same thing with Hungary, and being able to knock the Hungarians out of the war. It's kind of interesting. Like one of the like in 1945, so one of the last actual usage of a large scale like German armored assault was actually into Hungary itself, basically just to kind of save the Hungarian capital and to try to keep the Hungarians in the war for longer, because they still need, one, I mean, obviously as many men as they can have on their side, but also they need supplies and things like that. And then one of their last commando operations conducted in the war was actually the kidnapping of the son of the leader of Hungary, to make sure that he knew what side he was still on in fighting the Soviets. So so obviously as the Soviets are moving through Eastern Europe, so strategically they're taking places like that, and they're also basically strategically setting themselves up in all these countries in the Balkans and in Eastern Europe and Central Europe. One, so they can set up post-war governments that are favorable to them, or that are nominally or just realistically under their control. One, so that obviously they have more power, they can project more power, but then also to set up these buffer states, because obviously the war in the East is just unbelievably catastrophic and destructive. And so a large reason why they set up the so-called Iron Curtain and then the Warsaw Pact and things later on was to buffer them, Russia and the Soviet Union proper from any potential aggression from the West, i.e. try to deal with as much of the fighting in countries that are not Belarus, the Ukraine, and Russia, deal with that somewhere else. They don't have to suffer the destruction themselves. So that's those are the primary countries I'm going to talk about there. I don't think I'm really going to talk about anything else. I've already touched a little bit on the Balkans in there, which again was primarily partisan related actions as far as the Western Allies were concerned. But the partisans were, obviously like Yugoslavia and things like that, like absolutely huge contributor to the war effort there, tied down tons and tons and tons of Germans. Basically as many Germans in the Balkans doing that as were in Italy, and there's a substantial amount of, upwards of 25, 30 divisions in Italy. So very big contribution coming from that. But I kind of hope that makes sense again. So just kind of thinking what we talked about here. So again, so a lot of this comes from like just moving from one area where we can project air power and other such power to be able to cover an operation into somewhere else where we can then project such power. But then also thinking about, okay, the Western Allies are going to have a huge material, a huge equipment, a huge manpower related advantage, but you have to find a way that you can get it into action. So being able to have the 8th Air Force in Britain, being able to have the 15th Air Force in Italy, huge deal. Invading France from the north in Overlord, and invading the south, in Dragoon, being able to get multiple large-scale ports going on, and then closing in on the German border from 2 directions, and being able to consolidate on that, very big deal. But I hope that makes sense to you guys. And remember, only the hits count, and you can never miss fast enough to catch back up.